it is a great pleasure for me and Marina and all the team of DL4T from the University Côte d'Azur and from the National Center of Scientific Research to welcome three outstanding colleagues in the field of digital competition law and economics, but also three friends. The idea of this seminar, of this virtual roundtable, was planted something like a month ago when the report of the Judiciary Committee on the investigation on competition in digital market was issued. This report from the Judiciary Committee was very interesting on several aspects. First, it seems to initiate or to make open the possibility to initiate something like a transatlantic convergence in terms of antitrust enforcement. It is not an Europeanization of US antitrust, it is not the point, but we have a possible convergence on several matters. The first one is a single firm conduct, that is to say, unilateral practices. I find some words, some sentences in this report as abuse of dominant position, something like abuse of economic dependence, which makes sense in an European way to address issues and not the conventional way in which we understand the notion of monopolization since the 70s. So it was a first point of convergence. A second point of convergence relies on presumption. That is to say, some practices which can be considered as competitive or anti-competitive per se, and it opens a path for shifting the burden of proof from the plaintiff to the defender and about thinking on the issue of the standard of proof. That is to say, what about the consumer welfare criteria? What about the protection of competition criteria? What about, for instance, notions like liberty of choice, protection of the competitive process, and why not fairness? And the third point, which was very interesting in this report, was the insistence on the issue of mergers. We have a huge debate about an under-enforcement in vertical mergers because of the influence of the Chicago School. Sorry, Filippo, for the reference, but also a risk of an under-enforcement in the field of horizontal mergers. So it was very important in the context in which we speak more and more about consolidating acquisitions, killer acquisitions, to see how to manage this issue in the field of mergers control. Our purpose was not to make a summary of something like a 40, 50-page report, but just to take some points, to take some notions like interoperability, merger controls and the standard and the reversal of the burden of proof, about self-preferencing in a virtual platform, and to deliver some insight about these issues, not to be exhaustive, but to be very subjective. That is to say, to underline that we work collectively on this issue, and we have something interesting to share on this point. During this month, we had a lot of novelty, a lot of new thing to take into consideration. It is not a second lockdown. It is not some defeats in the Champions League of the Olympique de Marseille, but a lot of unexpected events, like the procedure initiated by the Department of Justice against Google, with some connection, natural connection with the European case, but with some specificity. We have also in the field of merger, the action intended by the DOJ in the case of the merger between Visa and Plaid, something like a killer acquisition with not Marvelous, sorry, with a wonderful volcano, which is potentially something that we will see in all the textbook in a couple of months. And finally, the decision of the European Commission to initiate 1 week ago a procedure against Amazon. That is to say, the statement of objection in the case of the use of information coming from complementors, and the investigation about the buy box and the possibility of distorting competition. So I speak too much in a language that I am not able to speak correctly, that is to say English. So I will leave the floor immediately to our participants. And again, I want to thank them for participating and to be available for us and for our students. So we will start by Simonetta VEZZOSO from the Università di Trento about the issue of interoperability. It's very difficult to say, between platforms. Simonetta, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Frédéric. Thank you so much, Marina, for the invitation. It would be much better to be sur la Côte d'Azur, I imagine, than be where we are. And is there anything like Côte d'Azur University? I mean, what a branding.
Yes.
Congratulations.
I had proposed French Riviera University, but...
It's wonderful. So I tried to share my presentation, first of all. Okay, so I share the screen. Hopefully
it works.
You can see already the orange one. And then, okay, so I hope you can see my presentation. Yes, okay. So thank you so much. I would almost prefer skipping the presentation and start discussing among us. There are so many interesting things going on at the moment. My presentation, as Frédéric quite nicely introduced, is about interoperability. And the title would be a regulatory framework for interoperability in the time of digital gatekeepers, or wouldn't it be nice to solve such problems, all such problems in one go? Why do I say that? Well, first of all, we see here a lady who's pretty well known in our circles. She used to be the Commissioner for Competition, and then she switched. She was the Commissioner for the Digital Agenda. And in 2010, she said, complex antitrust investigation followed by court proceedings are perhaps not the only way to increase interoperability. The Commission should not need to run an epic antitrust case every time software lacks interoperability. And at that time, of course, she was quite busy with the enforcement of the Microsoft decision. I will seriously, she used to be as she was Commissioner for Competition. I will seriously explore all options to ensure that significant market players cannot just choose to deny interoperability with their product. 2010. You no doubt remember that I have some experience with the reticent high-tech companies. I had to fight hard and for several years until Microsoft began to license missing interoperability information. Okay, that was the plan. And also she added, wouldn't it be nice to solve all such problems in one go? And the answer, of course, is yes, but we are not there at all. So this is just reports, and these are the number of times that the word interoperability is mentioned. So the highest number goes to the final report of the CMA on online platforms and online advertising. There are also a few other ones, like the Marsden-Potsdam report mentioned in 19 times. It was published last week, the report of, let's say, the Chicago School and the Global Antitrust Institute report on the digital economy. And actually, one of the statistics the investigation of digital markets. Yes.
We have some difficulties with the sound.
Oh,
perhaps the connection is.
I'm sorry for that. Can you hear it?
Yes, yes, it's just right now.
I tried to shout, but is it just broken, or is it broken, the audio?
It's okay now, it's okay.
It's okay? Okay, I tried to shout then. Okay, so that would be the investigation of competition in digital markets that Frederic was mentioned before. And then in that report, you read that they mention in consumer reports published in September, which was a survey titled Platform Perceptions, Consumer Attitudes and Competition and Fairness in Online Platforms. And among its findings, 60% apparently support more government regulation of online platforms and mandating interoperability features to make it easier for users to switch from one platform to another without losing important data and connections. So what about the European side of it? Well, you know that mandated interoperability, of course, can be a competition law remedy. We mentioned the Microsoft case, and there are, of course, also merger cases. Then quite actual and keeps us very busy is the discussion of ex-ante regulation with do's and don'ts, with the blacklist, gray list is not clear at all yet. And then the other tool, that would be the dynamic market investigations framework. And the last two should converge into the Digital Markets Act that should be published on December 2nd, 2020. We keep our finger crossed also because some news concerning Commissioner Vestager, she needed to spend some time at home now. So that would be the European side, but we have things going on also at national level. And here I mentioned what Andreas Mundt normally calls competition law plus, and that would be there would be some amendments to the German competition law, and one of them, I think everybody in the room is familiar with that already. So undertakings with paramount significance for competition across markets, they are targeted, subject to they could be subject to certain obligations, include rules on interoperability that can be made binding ex ante for the undertaking, without ex ante in the sense that without finding of a prior infringement. And the other side, the other interesting amendment would be the prevention of unnatural tipping. So undertaking with superior market power that impedes competitors' independent attainment of network effects and thereby creates a serious risk of a considerable restriction of competition on the merits. So both of them somehow also possibly relate to interoperability. Again, on the US side, there has been this year, the end of last year, I can't remember exactly. So it was the presentation of a bipartisan bill called Access Act, Augmenting Compatibility and Competition by Enabling Service Switching, requiring that dominant platforms, again, what Frederic was also referring to, so those concepts that travel across the Atlantic, make user data portable and their systems interoperable. Okay, so those are, this is an overview of some of the reports. And our topic here is to try to draw lessons from the investigation in competition in digital markets. And decided that there were five lessons that we could take. Well, the first one is a friendly reminder, and that is that interoperability is fundamental to the open internet. So interoperability is one of the internet's structural characteristics that's been there for a while. Examples you might be familiar with, of course, are emails, which are open, interoperable protocol for communicating online, regardless of a person's email service or the type of device used. And it is curated by the Internet Engineering Task Force. And then there are also other standards, like, for instance, social web standards. Curate is one managed by the World Wide Web Consortium, and that relates, for instance, to Twitter-like services like Mastodon. Perhaps you are familiar with that. So there are a few standards already. So the second point that really we can draw from those reports is the understanding that there is quite a lot of degradation of interoperability already going on, and almost every gatekeeper does it. So things that you read in those reports, Google's allegedly inhibiting interoperability between ad platforms and non-Google ad platforms, Amazon allegedly degrading interoperability of AWS, Facebook degraded the cross-posting functionality, which allows third parties developed with permissions to make automatic processes are related to its user of Facebook activity, to user Facebook newsfeed. That was the CMA. Then we're all very well familiar with Apple's walled gardens, so limiting interoperability of its intelligent voice assistant, negating access to near-field communication chips, etc. And the aspect of intelligent voice assistant is possibly also the object of a market inquiry that the European Commission launched, and interoperability there was clearly an area of concern. And then, of course, Microsoft, you know. The third point is that one does not simply enjoy the power of network effects forever. And so once the market has steeped due to stronger network effects, the gatekeepers do not face anti-competitive, do not face competitive pressure anymore. Of course, interoperability as such is unlikely to fully restore competition in deep markets due to the current lack of meaningful competition in those markets. But still, and that would be the second tool, the new competition tool, as it used to be called, mandate interoperability can prevent future tipping of digital markets. Again, the example of the assistants, personal assistants like Siri, etc. First point. What are the technological choke points here? I think this is one of the most intriguing and perhaps interesting parts of the whole initiative. So pro-competition and innovation interoperability principles still need to be developed. That's quite clear. But there are some lessons there, and they are mentioned in different reports. We can learn from previous competition enforcement cases. We can learn from interoperability obligation in other sectors like telecom. We can learn from experience of standard setting organizations and their failures. So there is quite a steep learning curve, but there are already examples there. Then interoperability, of course, is not just data portability. It's ability of internet technologies to work together, and also perhaps to choose the platform you prefer, also to do a competitor to Zoom, and why not, to be able to still use it and to have it interoperable with other platforms, and perhaps you choose another one which is a little bit more data protection, respectful data protection. Then we should consider, when we talk about interoperability, of course, the horizontal dimension, but also the vertical dimension. And then we need, I think that's the most important point, perhaps and the most disregarded so far, we need a more technological approach in the sense of proactively identifying the technological choke points, which become opportunities to promote and impede competition. And that applies well beyond messaging services, social networks. This is really a little bit the future, think of fintech, think of cloud services. It's very important that competition authority or whatever regulator starts really to act proactively. And then there is what about the framework? How do we do it in terms of remedy within whatever technological tool or regulatory tool you can think of? Well, I think that, for instance, the CMA developed in the Annex W of the final report a nice assessment framework which takes into consideration also the impact on innovation incentives. Okay, so the last point, lesson. What if I told you that a new era for interoperability has begun? I think we are really there. So, of course, mandate interoperability will always be a complement, not a substitute to vigorous competition enforcement. And of course, the Amazon case that Oliver is going to discuss is a good example of that. Then, in the sense that the two things should run parallelly. Then we need to move relatively quickly to the how. And for instance, here I quote a report by Marston and Postum, when they talk about sensible rules, safeguarding the benefits of digitalization, not operating silos, preserving innovation incentives. They should be flexible in terms of forward-looking, evolving with tech developments. The regulatory framework should be functional, backed up with effective enforcement, should be leveling the regulatory playing field as well. There are huge asymmetries in capabilities, access to data between enforcers and digital gatekeepers. And then there should be a sort of progressive level of enforcement. And they show it really related to interoperability. So the level of enforcement, of course, should be progressive in the sense that if it's an independent newcomer, first 2 years, no obligation. And then when the platform is dominant, but not across markets again. So we should really start thinking seriously about this way of progressive level of enforcement. And then the last point is, of course, well, yes, if we go the way we want to go along the regulatory path, then there are new possibilities, of course, and I think this is something that the European Commission is moving to. So interoperability is increasingly seen as part of the digital transformation agenda. So, for instance, in 2 days' time, there will be the proposal for a regulation for data governance will be put on the table, and this is part of this digital transformation. I think a very important part. Conclusions, brief ones. Yes, there are so many reasons to be grumpy about competition policy in digital age. So little time. We need to move fast, and I look forward to your comments and to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Simonetta, for your presentation. We will open the discussion after the 2 later presentations, but what is very important with interoperability is that it promotes both the competition in the market, that is to say, within an ecosystem, and by definition, the competition between the ecosystems, that is to say, the competition for the market. So it is very important to make the market more open, and interoperability is a way to allow the complementors a way to exit from an ecosystem to another. So it is very important, and the point on the more technological approach in terms of digital markets regulation is essential. So we'll go on the presentation of Nora MEMETI Ziba. Nora is professor of law in the Law School of Kuwait. And again, Nora, thanks for being available.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Here is 7:30 now. It's good. It's evening. I'm so happy to be with you guys, and it will be great if we were somewhere else having drinks and talking about these things, but what can we do? It's great that we can have this opportunity. I'll share my slides now. Let me see. I haven't used this for a long time, so I hope I can. Okay. Yes. Maybe you can help me. Is there something I can do here when I? Yes. Okay. I think I got it. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Not yet, Nora. It doesn't function.
It was functioning earlier. I tried this, but it seems now I have a problem. That's not very nice. I had some cute slides there. Let me see.
If you want, you can send your slide by email and I can
Yes.
make the presentation.
Yes. Or maybe I can send you the slides and then you can continue with Oliver. Do you think that will be better?
Okay, if Oliver is okay, I send you my email on Gmail. It is quicker than the one of the CNRS.
Yes.
Oliver, you will speak about not an interoperability, not about the merger control, but about self-preferencing and the dual role of ecosystems, of some of the ecosystems. So that is to say, you are perfectly in time with the current hot topics in the EU. So Oliver, the floor is yours. And again, thanks for participating to the seminar.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me and for inviting me. So I'm trying to share my slides now and hope that this works.
Yes.
So hopefully you're seeing them now. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. What I'm going to present here is sort of the interface of two joint work groups, one with Frédéric and Patrice, and the other one with Sophia Gensle from my chair and Nadine Lindstedt-Reusicke from Pforzheim University, and sort of the presentation sort of mixes these two projects and hopefully comes out to something sensible. Talking about the dual role, I think I don't really have to motivate among this group why this is an important thing, as there are many cases where it's discussed, and also in ASCOLA we had many presentations touching upon that issue. So I will save that time and go immediately into the topic by just giving to you the two questions I'm going to address in this talk. The first is when do dual role phenomena occur? And the second is the question, which is of course the overall decisive one: when are they actually anti-competitive? And in order to answer these questions, I will draw on economics literature that recently has popped up in the last 2 to 3 years. I will report to you what this literature says and trying to give some meaning for a competition policy and antitrust perspective. Now, I don't have very beautiful pictures on my slides, but at least a graph that tries to give some idea about the dual role phenomenon. And what I have on this slide is a vertical supply chain starting upstream from a producer or a seller of something, which then, when we think about an online thing, it goes then to some online retailer. And then there is a special,
Sorry for interrupting you, but I'm not seeing your other slides, only the first one.
Okay.
I don't know about the others, but.
Is it the same for the other ones?
I'm just seeing the.
Yes, Oliver, we have just the first one. And
okay.
not,
yeah. So you have to enter perhaps in presentation mode.
I am in presentation mode, so
and then perhaps it's the other screen. If you have two, perhaps do you have a? I have no idea, but it happens to me all the time as well.
do you see it now?
We are still seeing the first one.
Okay, just a second. I hope to solve it. So next try. Good, perfect.
Excellent.
So I was talking about this slide actually, and hopefully you can now see this wonderful vertical supply chain. And I started to talk about about a stage which sort of has a special role in this, in most of these dual role talk, not in all the facets, but in many facets, which is the one which is briefly called SRS here. And SRS just means search and recommendation systems. And what we can see basically in virtually all of the cases where we have a dual role phenomenon is that some automatic algorithmic search and recommendation system plays a role. By, for instance, biasing its results or by presenting specific things and not presenting other things. And so we included this into this vertical chain here. And then, of course, downstream, the consumer comes at the end of the day. And what is important to understand the dual role phenomenon is that we need some kind of vertical integration along this chain. Yeah, so as long as each of this chain, and the emphasis here is on the search and recommendation system, because that's the project with Sophia and Nadine is all about. But it is the same for all the other stages. As long as each stage is not integrated, there is no dual role problem. The dual role problem comes up as soon as the stages are integrated. For instance, if the stage where the search and recommendation systems takes place is vertically integrated with the retailer, in the case of Amazon, for instance, or also in the case of Spotify, then the possibility emerges that the search and recommendations get biased into a direction in favor of some of the goods and against the others. And particularly difficult, of course, it gets if also the producer or seller upstream stage is integrated, which is called vertical integration 2 here. And that would be the case, for instance, with Netflix, which also have their own productions, their own movies. And then the question is, what about the competition between the Netflix productions and Disney productions or productions from small producers? And we also have that, of course, in the Google search case, where we have Google Shopping, Google Maps, and others on this upstream level, where Google then competes with others, but uses maybe its Google search to influence the results. So that is particularly referring to the first of these issues which are mentioned here, the biasing the algorithmic search and recommendation systems in favor of own upstream goods, which is usually also called self-preferencing. However, self-preferencing can also have other dimensions. For instance, the use of data from competitors to improve own upstream goods. Yeah, an example would be Netflix learning from how consumers react to productions of others to make their own productions better. Yeah. And we can discuss whether this is actually anti-competitive. Maybe this is pro-competitive, but it is some sort of self-preferencing in the sense that I'm using something from the downstream level to improve my upstream competitive position. And of course, another area where this is done is the Amazon case that Simonetta already referred to, where Amazon uses a lot of data also to decide what do we sell through our own shops, what do we allow others to sell on our marketplace, and how do we shape the conditions. And this leads to the third area, where it's not only about using competitor data, so to say, on merit to improve your own goods, but where it is about handicapping upstream competitors by, for instance, exclusion from the service When Amazon decides that the shop X is not allowed to sell something anymore because Amazon wants to do it by itself, hypothetically. I'm not talking about any evidence here, I'm just giving examples. Or as we have, as the discussion is in the Epic game case, not directly maybe excludes, in this case it's an app store, not directly excludes apps from competing upstream producers, but gives a penalty tax on it, makes it more unattractive to get sold. Or other things which were discussed in the Amazon ebook case, for instance, is delay of service, when suddenly books from other publishers than my own publisher take months to get delivered. And again, I'm all talking about things that were discussed in the literature. And a refusal of business information. If I run a shop on the marketplace and Amazon doesn't tell me what my turnovers are, and I get just some general payments and don't know how they work, and consumer data gets not delivered, etc. pp. These all, if it takes place like that, which, as I said, don't have evidence, I'm just talking about what is discussed about this. If this takes place, would certainly be handicapping upstream competitors, and it is a possibility if this dual role phenomenon emerges. Some examples are here, and I've mentioned, I think, all of them, so I don't have to go into that again, and can go to the next slide, which is about what economic research has found out about this recently. And the way that economic research works is often, same with platform competition, is often the case that economic modeling identifies factors that promote a certain behavior, that increases the incentives for companies to engage in a certain behavior, or frustrates this kind of behavior. And this is also how you should read this slide. These are factors which are listed here, which ceteris paribus, taking each other for it alone, are making the incentive bigger for companies to engage in self-preferencing, and it doesn't mean that any factor alone guarantees self-preferencing, but we can generally say the more of these factors are fulfilled and the better these factors are fulfilled, the higher is the likelihood that self-preferencing emerges. And these factors are, some of them I think is very clear, is of course market power on any of the stages. Downstream market power, meaning market power, for instance, on the retailing level or on this level of search and recommendation systems, the famous gatekeeper position that Simonetta already addressed. But also upstream market power can lead to the same phenomenon. I don't think there's good real-world examples for that, but the models in economics show us that if it was the other way around, that there was a lot of competition on the search and recommendation level, but no competition or not a lot of competition on the upstream level, then it could actually lead to the same phenomenon then based on the exclusivity of content. And very hypothetically speaking, you could imagine that a Disney-run platform could maybe engage in such a behavior because it has all the Disney content and may therefore be not based on the superiority on the retailing level or the streaming level, but based on the superiority on the content level, may actually also engage into self-preferencing behavior, very hypothetically. And literature also shows that when we talk about market power, we often equal it with market dominance or with monopoly-like position. In law, in my experience, more than in economics, because in economics we think about market power can already emerge with very small advantages. And therefore, I would like to emphasize here, that's the third point, that relative market power is already sufficient to create significant incentives for self-preferencing. So that doesn't need to be a dominant position. Having an advantage on any of these levels is already promoting self-preferencing. Then, of course, a very important role also is assigned to the role of the consumer, to the consumer behavior in these markets. And this is the point about the insensitivity of consumers, in the sense that what promotes self-preferencing, or the incentives to engage in self-preferencing, and the insensitivity of consumers to biased recommendations and or to handicapping strategies, of course, helps. Yeah? So if consumers don't realize or don't care about biased recommendations, and if consumers don't mind about if an app store throws out competing apps, and just willingly and happily take the one that is now offered and from the vertical integrated company, then of course it makes it much easier for companies to do that. We call this a low bias elasticity of demand in a more technical term. And this is a particularly interesting reasoning or interesting point, because this is something which may be difficult to influence from an antitrust policy point of view. From an antitrust policy point of view, it's difficult to go to the consumers and say, you have to behave in a different way. But if consumers would, so to say, penalize behavior which is abusing this dual role situation, then a lot of problems would not emerge. The other points may be a bit more special, in the sense that they are not so much in the antitrust decision as far as I can see, but they also come out of the economics discussion. Another factor which is helping self-preferencing to come into play is the existence of essential superstar or must-have content or goods within the integrated firms. Yeah? So even if there's no dominance or no superior market power, if there's some contents for the company that wants to engage in self-preferencing that the consumers think they must have, then it also helps to engage in bias, going also beyond these narrow must-have contents, because consumers sort of have a preference for one-stop shopping, and if they choose this ecosystem because of the must-have content, then it's very probable that they won't leave it for any other content, even if there may be suboptimal results are happening. Next point: the smaller the differences in quality or in utility that it brings to the consumers between the goods from the integrated and the non-integrated upstream providers are, again, the easier it is to engage in self-preferencing. The reason sounds a bit complicated, but what it basically means is, think about this case where in the US, the leading parental advice app was thrown out of the app stores because the app store, the vertical integrated company, brought their own, well, maybe not because, but incidentally at the same time. Yeah, when they brought their own company, let's assume it was because. If the quality difference between the former market leader that is not available anymore and the substitute from the integrated firm is very small, then consumers, even if they are critical, will still very quickly be satisfied in using the new one, the alternative one, and it means that the company more easily gets away with self-preferencing, in the sense that the negative consumer reaction doesn't take place that much. So small quality differences make it easier to engage into self-preferencing. Penultimate point: the maturity or saturation of markets. So this is actually very interesting, because we haven't reached that stadium in many of the markets we discuss by now. But economic theory predicts that, especially when the growth period and the dynamic period where lots of companies try themselves out in these markets, when this period ends and we get into a more saturated, more stable, maybe even more sclerotic market, then the incentives to engage into self-preferencing will become even higher, because it will mean that in the end of the day, outside innovation is reduced. And if there is less innovation coming from the outside, it's easier to force consumers to accept biasing and to accept suboptimal solutions that are brought to them. So this is, I think, a very important insight, because it means that if we think self-preferencing problems are already evil today and problematic today, we are in for them getting much more problematic in the future when these markets get more matured and more saturated. And eventually, also from the theory, and don't think there's an example for that yet, but options to personalize prices, options for price discrimination, also make it easier to self-preference, again, because it's harder to detect and harder to look through for the consumer. And probably research will find many more factors. So this is ongoing research. This has basically just started. You can also see that the sources I'm drawing on are very new, and the discussion is just ongoing. So there's certainly more to come. Which also means that regulatory implications from that are preliminary. And still, even though they are preliminary, I still will give them to you because we want to get into an antitrust policy discussion, of course. And I assume, and this is, we can discuss it critically, but my assumption for the regulatory implications is that we want to preserve the advantages of these digital ecosystems while combating welfare decreasing practices. I just say that because there are also opinions that maybe want to get rid of these ecosystems in total, yeah. But here the assumption is that we want to preserve the advantages that come out of that. And this assumption certainly is crucial for the next, or for the first insight from the economic literature, which is that general industry-wide sector regulation represents an inadequate regulatory tool for addressing these ecosystems. Because it harms innovation. Yeah, we know that from all sector regulation, they basically all harm innovation, maybe with the exception of excess regulation. Yeah, we can discuss that. But in this case, at least the literature that we have so far, yeah, concludes that the danger of harming innovation at least is very big. And as related to that, but also going beyond that, there is a high risk that sector regulation deters the pro-competitive effects of commercial digitization, because one of the factors that make commercial digitization welfare increasing, consumer welfare increasing, is that digital ecosystems quickly react to what consumers want. And under a strict regulatory regime, quick reactions are something that usually don't work out very well. And so this also creates a big danger that this advantage goes away. Again, maybe with the exception of excess regulation, sector regulation usually has the perverted effect that it prevents future market entry, because working under a sophisticated regulatory regime is costly and requires a lot of knowledge. We have seen this with the data protection regulation, which also turned out to be easier to handle for very big companies, but very difficult to handle for small and new companies. Yeah, so this is a big issue. And this is related to the final point, which relates to the economic of bureaucracy, which tells us that the cost of regulation, the administrative cost of regulation, will increase over time once a sector regulation has been enacted. We can see through the history of regulation that regulation hardly gets less, gets smaller. It usually increases and gets more and more complicated. And also regulation very rarely disappears. Even in cases where the problem has disappeared, regulation usually goes on. Justus Haukapp has written a nice book on for Germany for finding more than 100 regulations where actually the thing that was regulated has disappeared, but the regulation is going on is still beside that. Yeah, and then this increase in administration and bureaucracy of regulation becomes very expensive and also aggravates the points before that. There may be some exceptions in terms of excess regulation, and maybe we can also discuss whether mandated interoperability, which if it can be kept to this simplicity of that sentence, maybe an exception of that, but these are very general concerns. And the more comprehensive a sector regulation is, and thinking about self-regulating algorithms may be very comprehensive, these dangers become more and more prevalent. So what about competition policy then? That seems to be a more adequate tool, as it actually addresses the disadvantages and the problems. And of course, the authors in the literature also address this, and we also address this in some papers. And one of the things that is discussed currently is whether vertically integrated companies, dual role companies, so to say, should be broken up into several independent companies. The theoretical economic literature is skeptical about that. And I'm reporting this. I'm not sure yet whether I'm following this thinking for myself, but I'm reporting this here. And the reason is that the literature argues that the vertical integration also may necessary for allowing for certain innovations and for a certain quality of service, which then with the breaking up would also disappear. I think this is something which can be discussed, and I'm with myself a bit careful, but at least this is what the literature says. What seems to be very clear, and this is astonishingly, while this was 10 years ago, this would have been a very controversial point among economists. Nowadays, it's very difficult to find economists who don't agree with the next line. So there has been taken a big change in that area. And that is that actually what is necessary is to prevent horizontal market power and prevent vertical integration. And the focus that we have, for instance, in merger control on horizontal mergers and the very lax is a bit mean, but you know what I mean, attitude against vertical mergers doesn't seem to be justified here because preventing such situations, of course, is always better than intervening afterwards. Prohibiting self-preferencing strategies in the sense of saying you're not allowed to do this if you have a certain position maybe. So a more active antitrust policy against abusive strategies is also welcomed by the economic literature and seen as welfare increasing, but not if it is done through neutrality obligations. Neutrality obligations, again, referring to this stage of search and the recommendation systems, neutrality obligations, then requiring some randomized ranking or something like that, because since then you can't gain anything by being better than the other ones on the upstream level, because you will be randomized, found or recommended. This actually has, according to Dipartimento and Taylor, excellent paper, this actually has negative welfare effects. So a more active merger control and prohibiting self-preference strategies seems preliminarily the way to go. And looking into the economic literature, it seems to be the way to go, especially accompanied by an extension of the market power concept that we usually use in antitrust policy, in the sense that in digital ecosystems, we shouldn't look at dominance in single markets, but looking more into something I would call systemic market power in within these ecosystems. And Simonetta already mentioned this idea of a paramount significance across market, or an outstanding relevance across market. Can discuss how to translate the German suggestion into English, suggested by the German reform, but based basically, I think, on a lot of reports, inter alia, the English report. This actually seems to be an idea which very well fits to the economic insights, so that we much earlier, already with sort of like systemic and relative market power, say, okay, you have some market power, so you fall under some special responsibilities. This could be a way forward, but of course there will be more economic research, maybe bringing us additional insights. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Oliver. Thanks for your presentation. Just one point, very important. You quoted 2 times the issue of consumer behavior. Yeah, I think it is very important, because we consider problems in some silos, that is to say competition laws and so on, and addressing such concerns imposes to consider how to cope with consumer bias, consumer preferences, and so on. Perhaps with the competition tools and the regulatory tools, we cannot address some issues. You raise also some very essential points about the cost of regulation and the case in which regulation can be something like a suboptimal tool in a dynamic environment compared to competition law. And it is really some very, very essential points, I think, for our discussion. So
yeah, absolutely, especially if you think that some people raised in administration. I mean, we also are administration in some way, so this is not meant to.
Yes, we are some civil servants, you and me.
People within the incentive system of an administration start to decide how retailing should work, or how search and recommendation systems should work. I don't have a good feeling with that one.
Yes, but it will be impossible in France. In Germany, perhaps, but not in France. It's not our tradition. So we'll go from Ilmenau to Kuwait City with Nora. Nora, I have your slide.
Yes, please do share.
Yes, so I will share. I think it will be okay. Do you see the slide, Nora, or not? Yes?
Yes.
Excellent. So you have just to say to me next slide and so on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to bother you.
Oh, no.
Okay, so good afternoon once again. So glad to hear you guys. Now, I will totally talk from another perspective, not the economical one. I love the economical one. Time after time, I feel that we lawyers dealing with competition law really need the economical perspective, and we learn a lot from economists. We are lawyers. We want to control businesses. We want to control traditional digital business. We want to make rules and to tell them how to do business. This is how we are. And time after time, I really feel that we don't understand them. However, this time, I'm on the other side. So I'm really against the new rules that enforcers, academia, and from the competition community are trying to prove that we need to make mergers to shift the evidentiary burden of proof to defendants. Now, this is something new. This is something that it has been done before. We all have that in our criminal laws. You can go to the next slide, no problem. So as a general matter, it's not that it's wrong. Nothing is wrong with presumption of law. It's the presumption of innocence is closely related to freedom, to liberty. We want to see it like that. It's very specific to criminal law. I'm sure you all know that the law holds that it's better 10 guilty person escape than one innocent suffer. In open market, we don't want them to suffer. So we don't want mergers and companies to suffer. If they suffer, if they don't have the liberty, the freedom to be engaged in the market, and we want to tell them how to do this business, and we want to control them, I feel personally that we do have a problem here. So because we're invited today to mainly be focused on the House Judiciary Committee investigation, competition digital market report. Yes, you can go to the other slide. Then I'll try to focus on that, but of course, comparing it all the time with what we have from the other jurisdictions. Now, you know, we had the CEOs of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google there, and we saw the report after 16-month work, and they maintained their dominance partly by picking off up and coming competition in killer acquisitions. Okay, so they have used their monopoly power to act as gatekeepers. This is what the report says. They do undermine potential competition. They pick winners and losers. So if you see from 1998, in the big tech, there are more than 500 companies not checked in being cleared all. So this is something that I think for competition community living in Europe, this is not a big surprise, but I was surprised that this came as a surprise for US, both for researchers and academia there. Now, some cases that were used, which I think are very superficial. In the next slide, you see how, for example, it says Facebook acquired Instagram to neutralize them. Facebook acquired WhatsApp when WhatsApp was in big loss, I guess for the same idea. Google did the same, so they acquired Waze to eliminate the independent provider of mapping data. They did that with DoubleClick to have a commanding position. From a business perspective, well, this can be seen as a normal thing. Now, other reasons that they are mentioning in the report that the antitrust laws should be strengthened. You can go to the other slide. I think you're there, yes. So because consumer welfare, the price and output has been the sole goal of US antitrust, we all know that for a long time now, rather than the competitive process, because underdevelopment has been preferable to overdevelopment, and because Section 7 Clayton Act is too broad, therefore it's very difficult to challenge all these mergers. So this is in a way, they come with codifying bright line rules and giving us some structural presumption. This was new, something unexpected to be done. I do understand that this is already found in the other report. Therefore, they tried to include the structural presumption, and they tried to define broadly by saying that under this presumption will be mergers, the single firm controlling an outsized market share or resulting in significant increase in concentration. Therefore, they will be prohibited under this section. Okay, how are they going to do this? So they try to place the burden of proof on the merging parties. The structural presumption would place the burden of proof upon the merging parties to show that the merger will not reduce competition. Now, this is not enough. Showing that the merger would result in efficiencies should not be sufficient to overcome the presumption that is anti-competitive. Defendants will now bear the burden if, of course, this is all under if. So they will now bear the burden of proof to show that the merger won't reduce competition without even getting to refer to efficiencies that could benefit consumers. Another, I call here deviation, I can be wrong, but I think that another deviation, what the Congress mentioned, is that the 30% threshold established by Supreme Court in Philadelphia National Bank is appropriate, although a lower standard for monopoly or buy or power claims may deserve consideration. So here we go and talk about the discretion of authority, new change. The structural presumption, am I there? Are you with me? Are you following me? Yes, thank you. Yes, so these gatekeepers mentioned today and mentioned so many times this year have acquired potential rivals and national competitors. These two terms came from the report, not only from this report. I'll just go and mention also they have been discussed a lot. Potential are defining as firms planning to enter or could possibly enter the acquired market. Whereas nascent are firms whose prospective innovation represent a serious future threat to incumbent. In theory, they look perfect. Now, subcommittee recommends strengthening by changing the Clayton Act from where the effect of such acquisition may be substantially to lessen competition or to tend to create a monopoly, to prohibit acquisition that may lessen competition or tend to increase market power. We talk here about the future. So it's not new. It has been mentioned in other jurisdictions, but very difficult. Now we have the guidelines there, both for horizontal and vertical, and they both are issued for MSTC and DOJ and emphasize the importance of fact-specific inquiries into competitive effect. So it's not something that suddenly comes and wakes up, at least again from people from the other continent deal with that. So we have Furman Act here, report. It's nice to hear that Lina Khan was inspired by this report, which is one of the drafters of the House report, and therefore I guess that maybe she understood that the burden of proof should be totally shifted to the defendant. Although here we see that there is a principle alternative considered by the report that has been to introduce a legal presumption against acquisition by larger digital companies, with the burden of proof placed on the parties involved to provide that the merger will not be anti-competitive. So there is, if you go and try to clarify that thought, they try to think about both sides. Now, on the substantive front, if you stay there, the most relevant proposals revive around the possibility of making practices of mergers prima facie unlawful. So you see them and you say, no, you're unlawful. Now you wait for there. And this in particular relate to the features of the relevant market. And we all know that how it goes. Now also we have other reports here, as I mentioned, Kremer and others, Scott Morton report. A question that comes there, and it was very funny to see, is that a merger with an equally likely future competitor should be presumed unlawful. And then there is no definition, and then we don't know what is this unequally likely future competition means, and how we know. You see, when Facebook bought WhatsApp, we all know that. Well, you know, WhatsApp was in big debt, and nobody was interested in buying it. And yes, I know that's a field when data are in questions and it's analyzed from another perspective. But the same happened with Instagram. It's proven now that Instagram flourished after Facebook bought Instagram. So there are some things that we really must try to analyze and be critical and try to see objectively how the things are staying there. And to ask the question, why suddenly we have all this big love of shifting the burden of proof in favor of who? And now I'll take the liberty and say, well, basically this goes in the favor of agencies. And that is something that we have in the other slide. We say by shifting the burden of proof to the merging parties in cases involving concentrated markets, high market shares, codifying the structural presumption would help promote the efficient allocation of agency resources, would increase the likelihood that anti-competitive mergers are blocked. So here we see that under this proposal, in cases where concentration meets an arbitrary benchmark based upon the market definition, the presumption will be that the merger is illegal. So prima facie, we know, great, we work in a competition authority, but now it's easy. They notify to us and they tell us that, well, they cannot proceed. So if this adopted, plaintiffs would likely win more as a result of these proposed changes, including in cases where mergers are anti-competitive. Now, surely this does not necessarily mean it would be for the benefit of larger society or that the economic efficiency would be improved. Nothing like that. We just, you see, I have this interesting slide here. We use this back home in Macedonia and also in some other countries. So if you just can go into the other slide, Frederic, and it says, where there's a fire, wet and dry burn together. So what happens here, what we see is that changing the burden of proof to be against antitrust defendants would certainly lead to more condemnation of anti-competitive mergers, but it also lead to the deterrence of significant portion of pro-competitive mergers. So we burn all them together, and then we check what we have won, and basically. Now, another important thing that I found reading, and I really have a lot of respect for these people from academia, enforcement authorities, mainly from academia. We see influential scholars like Dennis Sokol and Carl Shapiro and Timo and Tommaso Valetti and all these influencers, people from which I have learned a lot. They do think that we should have the shift of burden on the defendant. Then we have Vestager, we have the German and French competition authorities who in the president of whom in different conferences, they were jointly stating that it will be a great idea if they try the burden. Again, they will have the tools on checking the mergers. It's something that I don't really get, because they shift the burden, then they will go and try and have the same procedure. Now here we have a huge change of administrative procedure, taking all together with antitrust competition, but this is what we have. This is how that looks in practice. I didn't mention the courts today. It will be, I hope, in my paper. This webinar came as a nice surprise when we talked with Fred and others. And now I'm thinking for more than 3 weeks that this should be a good paper there, and then the courts should be included. And you see, it's very nice when the court will just say to them that now they should do their job, they should prove what they have to tell us, so the burden of proof stays on them. So here I have some arguments in favor and some in contra. So first I go with the favor. So in the digital industry, the shift of burden should be achieved because, let's see what they say. So from what I read, based on my knowledge, there is a symmetry in human resources and expertise in both merging companies and national competition authorities, and of course, European Commission as well, and then the US authorities, agencies. There is a symmetry on data and information, and there is a symmetry in financial resources. We all know how much enforcers are in need they are requiring for their financial aid to increase. Therefore, the leveling, the playing level field is really risky here. And the most important argument, what was mentioned today, is that innovation will be put under a big question mark. The companies will really not have incentives to go and think about innovating, even when they will buy a company. Small companies will acquire, let's say, the so-called national companies, which we still don't know how they will be defined in the future. Let's go with some arguments at contraria, why the shift it's considered not suitable. First, I think because these markets, we all know here in this forum that they're fast, they're unpredictable. I just gave you some example. I know that I just read today, and it was funny how Google at the time of their establishment were trying to sell themselves, and they couldn't do that. So now we have what we have. The business model is still not clearly defined, and the market, it's not defined yet. Finally, what we have from a law perspective, we do have breach of fundamental principles. So we do have breach of due process and fairness, shifting the burden to defend and defend our sense of basic due process and fairness. The notion that all mergers are unlawful with no showing from the governmental places agency. The agency will become a super regulator at the time, and this comes from the US, and I do believe, and we know how, we saw at least how the laws, how difficult were for them to tackle their national champions. We have other weaknesses, but at least, as I said in the beginning, we try to tell them who the boss is. The law doesn't prohibit mergers and acquisition per se. We should not forget that. So it's something, it's very similar to dominance, to monopolies. Big is not bad. The law should not condemn mergers just because they are large. And the presumption cannot and should not be that every merger should be considered harmful. Now, transparency and legal certainty must be respected. I think I'm done here with the slides. Now I'll just to sum up at the end for the report recommendation. So I want to see, I know that there are only proposals, there are only suggestions. I know that they are inspired from different reports. The reports are, every day are coming out different reports and large reports. And now I see this individual school producing reports. When you know the source, at least you know what you expect. And here, for people who are in this forum, I'm sure that you do understand that there are clashes of different interests here. However, I do think that there will be harm if the burden shifts to the defendants, and this harm will be felt not only to them, but you will be much more likely to lose, regardless of whether they have violated the law. The consumer welfare will not be there in the main focus anymore. Something that we do forget time after time, and something that we heard from Oliver today, that the consumers don't really, if I understood him correctly, I hope so, the consumers don't really care from where the product comes, as far as they are happy with the product. And if they have no other offer, if they have no other choice. You see, today I couldn't share my slides. I had no option at that instant, so I couldn't do anything. But in the future, I'll be trying to think to have other, at least, but we have one forum all together here. So I really think that it should not be gone from one extreme to another. It should be very careful in how the politics, first of all, the enforcers, what path they'll try to choose in dealing with the control, let's say, and tighten the mergers in the digital market. Thank you very much. I'm here for questions.
Thank you very much, Nora, for your very stimulating communication. Just 2 points. First, the issue of the equilibrium. We started in the 60s. I wasn't here, but the US antitrust in the 60s started with the brown shoe case law, in which we prohibited mergers, since the acquiring company has something like 15% of the market, and the acquired company with 1%. Now we tend to accept each concentration, just because we do not really control this concentration, because sometimes the structural criteria are not relevant. Just look at the last merger, Visa and Plaid. If we consider the turnover of Visa and the turnover of Plaid, at the structural point of view, is not relevant, and even the relevant markets are different. So again, a relevant markets are one of the issues. Should we make a reasoning on the ecosystem or in the relevant market? And there is just a last point before leaving the floor to the discussion. There is one point in your development which was very important. It's the cost of error, the cost in terms of consumer welfare. And again, I was born at the moment, but in 1982, Frank Easterbrook wrote a paper on the relative cost of error in antitrust: false positive, false negative. We have here 2 questions: a question of probability, the probability of taking a bad decision, and a problem of the consequences of our decisions. Perhaps the probability of taking a bad decision is not enhanced. Perhaps yes, because of the asymmetry of information, because of the uncertainty. Perhaps in some markets, a bad decision can induce irreversible consequences. But if we adopt a precautionary concept of antitrust, we quoted Joshua Wright, but we can quote Wright and Portuez also on this topic. Perhaps we will go on prohibiting all vertical mergers or conglomerate mergers, whatever the potential benefit to the consumer. So the difficulty is always, and it is a difficulty for lawyers, in fact, a difficulty of balance between risk, between objectives. So I speak too much, and I will open the floor to the debate. Is there some question? I see a question from Francisco Mongua from Bogota. Javier, if you want to intervene, the floor is yours.
Yes, no, I have two questions. It's about, in practice, applying competition law principle from an analog area to a digital area would not actually affect technological progress. And a second one, I wrote three, but I want to do two only. In the practice, how to discover, to Professor Oliver, in practice, how to discover that tendency to for self-preference, how to prove it, which is the evidence that authorities are using to prove it in the practice. You talk about the Amazon or etc., Google, I thought. How to prove it in the practice for a competition authority. Thank you very much.
So, thank you. I think the first question was then addressed to me, or was it?
Professor.
So I just say a couple of things. Well, yes, based on these reports, we have seen that digital markets have some characteristics. Okay, we have found out about them. And so we know much more about these markets. And the idea would be to have good functioning competitive processes also in digital markets. But then, as also Oliver has mentioned, we have, for instance, app stores, and what it means to have an app store, how you control competition in the app store, and something that Frederick also referred to. So there are also new institutions, okay, they have emerged in these markets. And so the ecosystems perspective that Frederick was also alluding to, well, of course, we had quite a lot of literature on platforms, multi-sided markets, but very few actually still concentrating on ecosystem as such. We have some literature, economic literature in the information systems. Frederick is also well aware of that type of literature. There are so many questions still there, okay, to grasp and to understand how it works. So yes, it's not easy. So that's the idea. We want to have good competition processes in the digital age. We are in a hurry, okay, because of what's happening. So nice to have more research. That would be lovely. Well, on the 2nd of December, those proposals will be put on the table, okay, about ex-ante regulation. It would be lovely to have more time, but I'm afraid we don't have it. So that's but based on those reports, we have learned quite a lot. And there has also been enforcement, increasingly so, new investigations, new market studies, of course, quite a lot of things going on, but we are learning, okay? We have to learn quickly. That's my point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Maybe I can add very few things to that. First of all, I think, of course, how to identify self-preferencing, right? This, of course, may not be easy. And one thing, of course, would be to identify, this is what the economic literature does, to identify situations where anti-competitive self-preferencing is very probable and avoid these situations, which then turns to ex-ante policies like merger control and stuff like that. But of course, partly it's too late for that. Yeah? And I think when we talk about the exposed abuse control and stuff like that, it's basically, in a way, we must rely on complaints by others and then identifying strategies and prohibiting strategies. What, for instance, the mandating interoperability next to a regulation can also be an obligation following on an abuse control procedure. But of course, it may be difficult at times. I fully agree with that. And one of the traps and the challenges coming from the analog area to the digital area is that obligations or remedies that have been successful in the analog area and that we are used to in the analog area may have completely different effects in the digital area. We made a paper on, I don't know whether you're interested in football or soccer in that sense. There's these antitrust procedures against centralized marketing where they bundle the broadcasting rights and so on. And a famous remedy in the analog area has been that where people watched it on TV has been that the football associations were demanded to sell the rights in packages and not in one bundle, so that different operators, different TV channels show the games, but of course each game is exclusive still. And that was no problem because then it meant that viewers could just switch among channels and see this game here and that game here. Now they do the same in the streaming area, and it has the unintended effect that now if you want to watch all games, you have to buy several streaming accounts at different streaming companies, which puts a high burden of cost and also of informal cost in the sense of time and managing different accounts and so on the consumer. So actually this is now, which used to be a good remedy, has now turned into a consumer welfare harming remedy. Due to the different character of the digital world. And I think things like this is something we haven't thought of enough so far. We have to think more whether things that we are used to, which worked well in the past, are really working in this new environment.
Excuse me, a question. The football market of streaming is now a cartel. Do you think that, or we could say that, for example?
Yes, it was a cartel before. It is about allowing a cartel due to efficiency claims. Yeah, 101.3, if I got it right. All the law girls and guys may correct me if that's wrong. It's exactly this efficiency remedy, right? And that it is broadcasted by different TV channels was no problem in the old world, and it becomes a problem in the streaming world. And still the authorities are still mandating this no single buyer rule, as it is called, with the consequence that every football fan I know is complaining that he needs several accounts for streaming to get all these. So this is really a burden, and it's unintentional. Of course, it was never the intention. It actually should suit the consumer. Yeah, one of the conditions of 101.3 is that the consumer must benefit from it, and actually it's the obligation that makes it worse for the consumer. Yeah, and this is just an example. We wrote a paper on that, but this is just an example. And I think there are more of such things that we haven't really identified so far.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your questions.
Excellent. Other questions?
Frederic?
Guido?
Yes.
Thanks, Guido, for being here.
Thank you for
Guido
this great conference. A question for Oliver Budzinski. How different or how similar is the self-preferencing to applying the similar condition to users in equivalent situations? So differentiated treatment. How do you see, because these are two conditions that are often coupled in the legal analysis.
Sorry, I didn't understand to what you want to compare the self-preference.
What we call in differentiated treatment, which means selling your monopoly position to, in some way, to your user. So let's say you pay a commission, you pay a fee, and you get a different ranking, or you get different services. Because in this case, there's competition. There's also, it can be a potential source of unfairness related to platform to users, business users especially, but also consumers. So I'm curious to listen to you on how different you see these two hypotheses.
It definitely has to do something with it. Yeah, so there's certainly similarities. I think the different quality in that sense is that is the very nature of selling online based on search and internal search and recommendation systems that you individualize the rankings. Yeah? So the what you call differentiated treatment to the consumer is the standard and not any exception or whatever, and it is automatized. So it is based on algorithms, and it is also sort of almost unavoidable, because as soon as you look for something within a streaming service or on a marketplace on the internet, the order in which the results are brought to you entails a recommendation. As such, I think it has fundamental similarities, but it has a whole new quality. And whether there is an upstream differential treatment, then, so to say, comes on top of that.
Okay, thank you.
Now, one question from Filippo. Filippo, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks for the very interesting discussion and presentation. I think the question can be for all three, which is to understand, how do you see what should be the criteria to separate ex ante from ex post intervention? So on what basis should we create a rational system that allows us to say interoperability of self-preferencing or mergers? Like, what should be the criteria that is separate between both regimes, and how would this work out in practice? So thank you very much for the very interesting discussion.
Okay, should I start? Okay, so yes, it's a very interesting question. For instance, Andreas Mundt, the chairman of the Bundeskartellamt, was saying in a webinar last week that they have a working group within the German Competition Authority to find out about the new concepts within the ex-ante perspective. Well, they have a mixed system. They have this law, competition law plus, which is between, I would say, ex-ante, ex-post. But they are really posing those questions. What about the new concepts that we need to develop there? So from my perspective, it is in that direction that we should move. So perhaps some concepts which made sense within the ex-post perspective need to be seen differently. There are many concepts you could revise within the ex-ante perspective. We might use the same terms, but they may mean different things. And this is going to be perhaps even a little bit confusing. So what I think that would be a nice system, well, on the one side, we need flexibility, okay, definitely. On the other side, we need certainty. We have to, so it's a different balance. So I'm quite curious to see what's going to come out on the 2nd of December, because there are very serious issues there. So we really somehow we want to build a new system which is parallel to the traditional enforcement, and we still don't know how it looks like. But I think that this is really necessary to do that. So we really need to find also the courage to do that. And there are. And also another question is how far we can really get an inspiration from the ex-post perspective generally. So my example with interoperability, in what sense is it useful to look at case law on interoperability, okay? Or do we need different glasses to do that? So it's a very interesting question, very difficult one. We will see. I think it will be a learning process, little by little, but ex-ante regulation is the way to go.
Also, when I'm allowed to add something, and it's I cannot answer that in total, obviously, as it is a very fundamental question, but I can give you an example where I have built an opinion on that, so to say. And what we are currently doing is that, and I think rightfully so, is in many of the reports and in many of the initiatives in different countries, is that we try to extend our idea of market power beyond dominance and to focus more on economic dependence, focus more on relative market power. And I think we should also, especially with a view of ecosystem, think about a systemic market power, or as Simonetta often emphasized, the more technological approach. I think this has a lot of similarities. And when we do this in abuse control, then I think it is only logical that we also extend the market power notion in merger control in order not only to intervene ex post into situations where this market power is abused, but also in order already to prevent these such market power positions, and not only dominant positions, by merger control, by external growth of companies. And as such, I think, for me, there's sort of a symmetry between ex post interventions and ex ante interventions within competition policy. I'm not talking about regulation in the moment. I'm very narrow arguing, yeah, in the sense that what we try to correct ex post is something that we should also try to prevent ex ante. Yeah? And as such, I don't see, and in this narrow view, and it's a much narrower view than your question was posed, I don't actually see a conflict in that.
Thank you, Filippo. This is really very broad, and it is fundamental. I agree. This is why when I was reading for shifting the burden of proof, I really try to read from professors from academia mainly and from the enforcers why they want to push this forward. I know they fear from everybody saying that there's under enforcement, so okay, let's give a chance. Let's go with. But they're yes, I totally agree with Oliver. He's so experienced, and I agree that I agree from the economical sense that maybe we should have a Panadol before we have a headache sometimes, because we already got cold yesterday. But again, I'll go more with ex post. For me, as a lawyer, trying to look at these technological designs and models and businesses, I don't want to be the watchdog in front of the door. I want them, at least from the European perspective, seeing how they flourish in the US. I want them to have the chance and innovate until they infringe the rules. So if they infringe the rules, totally agree. They have done this and this and this, and we know, and we are so happy to see Google and Amazon and how the enforcers will deal with them. But without doing anything, without having the threshold, even going under the threshold, only because we are afraid. Let's be afraid, like it's the corona thing right now. This year, let's not go outside because it will catch us. I think that the enforcers and the designers of the regulations should be very careful with ex ante, at least for us, that we don't have, we are not known for innovations. Thank you.
When I'm allowed to I fully agree with you, especially when we talk about ex ante regulation. One of the interesting things, and I don't know this, I'm really speculating here in the moment. One of the interesting things would be when we talk about merger control, whether any of the useful innovations that we have from these big companies, GAFAM and how we want to call them, whether any of that is actually relying on a merger that they undertook. Yeah, so if we hypothetically had prohibited all of the mergers of these companies, would that have slowed down or stopped innovation? And I don't know the answer, but this is probably something someone should have a look into it. Straight away, I wouldn't be too pessimistic about innovation, even if we would have done such a radical thing, which I wouldn't promote.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Is there some additional questions? No? So perhaps one very last question for our three panelists, always about mergers. What about ex post remedies in mergers? It is one of the proposals in the report of the Judiciary Committee. Are such remedies possible to implement? Costly? I do not know. What about your feeling on this idea?
Can I just say?
Yes, you can.
I'll be brief there, because I was happy in a way to see how the drafters of the report mentioned that they have been inspired from Europeans in that sense. And I said, great, it's one thing to be inspired and the other thing is to think like them. So I really hope that I don't talk only about GAFAM. So there are also other companies now. There are many companies now. They are not efficient. They just will disappear from the market. I would love to see let's say the final report from the US, first hours, which will inspire them, but maybe the opposite side, I don't know. But I would love to see how they are trying to put this on the table and to get them then make aware that sometimes our babies may make mistakes, and then try to deal with the babies. I'm not sure that this will change a lot. It depends from the politics. In the US, it's very sensitive. These issues are sensitive there right now. But let's wait and see. I would like to see the post effect. I was reading from different professors from academia. I like to see that they control mergers, and the mergers infringe the market. They do deterrence. Yes, we should be there for them in order to teach them the rules and so on. But at least there should be, I think, again, ex post. I'm more on that side. It's fine if it is ex ante. It's fine if there are remedies, but the remedies and the rules should be clear. We have to have legal certainty. We have to have transparency. There, we must play fair in the market in order not to discourage the innovation. Once they know what is the threshold, once they know why they buy the other company. I told you Google wanted to sell themselves, and the other company was not willing to buy them. Facebook bought the Instagram when Instagram, nobody knew about Instagram. And I don't have any sympathy for Zuckerberg, but he said, we made them big, we made them important. They came to our big family, and then this is how they grew. So we really have to read a lot about these ecosystems in practice, and then to think about the remedies. I know that there is no time. I know that, and it's good that there is no time, not only for us today, but for the drafters. And it's good that there is no time. It's fine. We can have a law. If we don't have the best, we can have something, and then with implementation, with training our administrators and judges, which we found in the US report that the judges have not been trained in relation to economical perspective for more than 30 years. So with these aspects, we can always fill the gaps. Thank you.
Excellent. Some final words from Oliver and Simonetta?
I can just continue, because I fully agree that except maybe even of merger control, and we may have further to discuss that one, but except of that, I think any ex-ante regulation really is dangerous of cutting down the advantages. And we get a lot of advantages from these digital ecosystems. Just remember the world, or imagine the world without the GAFAMs and what they brought to us. And I'm very surprised a bit by the shift of the discussion. I mean, 10 years ago, when you said Google may also do something which is not good, everyone was jumping on you and saying, no, this is all great and efficient. And now it's almost the other way around. Yeah? And the truth, and I fully agree with Nora in that regard, is somewhere in the middle. And especially we should be careful to think that we could, as regulators, as agencies, could determine what is good for consumers in the future. But of course, this doesn't mean that we can't prohibit things that are bad. And this is my merger control argument, avoid situations that are likely to bring the bad, at least by external growth. But this is certainly debatable. Yeah? So what is, I think, important when we talk about ex post is that we should also avoid to, you know, in some of the remedies that some of the bigger competition authorities bring about start to look almost like regulation nowadays. Yeah, so sometimes when antitrust authorities intervene, they don't just say, this is not allowed, don't do this, you get punished. They also start to say, but you should do this, and this should be done like this. And we even have that in merger control when they start to remodel the market after the merger. And there I would be in favor of being a bit more simple, trying to enforce more strict and more simple rules, even if they are a bit broader, yeah? And maybe then indeed say, you must be interoperable. It doesn't matter what you are arguing, instead of trying to really organize the interoperability. And I know this is easier to say than to do, but I think this is a borderline, an interface that we really have to explore.
The transition towards Simonetta is quite natural. So Simonetta, you will have the final word of this session, in fact. More than a word, in fact. Several sentences if you want.
Okay, no, so first of all, on the merger control front, I think that we are learning a lot about also acquisitions in the past involving Instagram and others. So there have been some studies related to the pharmaceutical sector, of course, the killing acquisition stuff. We still know relatively little about the nascent acquisition side of it. Okay? And that would be the Visa played case. So I'm really quite curious to see how it goes. We can learn a lot also in terms of a new theory of harm that perhaps we need for the digital age. And quite interestingly, the same merger was already investigated by the UK Competition Authority, which gave the green light to it. But my impression in reading both the decision by the CMA and what we have seen now in the complaint by DOJ is the fact that they were looking at different theories of harm, different evidence, different pieces of paper that went their way, so documents. So there is a very important aspect of that, the information that you get. Okay, and that perhaps brings us back to the point of Nora, because we might not have that information. That's why we need perhaps the shift in the burden of proof, if I may. So there are different things we have to consider. And perhaps one last point, there will be a question actually for Oliver, but I know that our time is up. Reading the press release and the other things that we have seen so far about the Amazon case, so the dual role case, not the e-commerce, because they're also there, where we have already stated no objections. My impression that it is really the first big data case.
Yes.
Okay? Because that's what they are referring to. It's not just a single manager working by Amazon peeping into the database. No, it's just the way they organize, okay, the collection and management of information. So what could that element add to the normal economic framing of this issue that you have been doing in terms of self-preferencing, technical self-preference, etc.? So that would be, so is there an added argument there or no?
So the final word to Oliver.
So now you expect me to give a brief answer to that, right? If I play the economist, and Simonetta knows that I'm usually not doing that, or the strict economist, yeah, and or just in order to give you a brief answer, I would say it doesn't matter as long as the effect is the same. Yeah, but of course this is only one side of it, and I think this will be very interesting for future discussions. And yeah, don't be angry that I leave it at that.
Excellent. So perhaps we should stop here. It is something very deceptive. Perhaps Guido, you want to intervene? No. So yes, Guido.
No. I just
okay.
Open the microphone for.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So again, thanks for your participation. The seminar will be available online, I think, just in 1 week, no more. I had some questions from the attendees. Is it possible to have your PowerPoint presentations in order to make them available to the attendees? Thanks, Nora, Simonetta, and Oliver. So Marina had to left some minutes ago, but Marina and me are very, very happy to this discussion. And again, it is just the start of a discussion from one seminar to another one. And I think we have a lot of converging paths in terms of research. So again, thanks for our participants. Thanks for Filippo, Guido, Javier, but also I see a lot of colleagues, notably from the Autorité de la Concurrence. Guillaume Perret is still here. Thanks for Sophia and Philippe for being here also, and thanks for our students. So I think the next seminar will be in 1 month, 3 weeks. So I will alert you as soon as the seminar will be online. So again, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you so much, Frederick, for the invitation, and to Nora, Oliver, and everybody else. Thank you.
Goodbye.